So that's Jesus' purpose there at the house of the high priest. But then we get into the deep, dark nighttime period, and Jesus is just held in custody, is what chapter 22 and verse 63 says. He's held in custody. So we want to imagine Jesus having already, having had a busy day, teaching in the temple, arranging for the Last Supper, being present to the Last Supper, doing his final teaching with his apostles there, talking to Peter about his denials, talking to Judas about his betrayal, washing the feet, although that's not in Luke, it's in John, but washing the feet of all of the apostles, having discussions about who is the greatest, all of those things going on, going out to the Mount of Olives. Now what happens is Jesus, we can gather, is kept up all night long. So besides the mental exhaustion that has already been documented by Luke, Jesus praying in agony in the Mount of Olives and sweat falling off of him like if he had a cut and blood was running out. Now he's going to be physically exhausted as he's not allowed to sleep because the guards they basically play some games with Jesus. And some of these probably were normal ways that prisoners and those accused were treated, but Jesus, being quite the celebrity and having had such a public face, likely gets more and worse of that than some others do. So here's the reading of those first several verses in Luke 6 and verse 63. Now the men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him as they beat him. They also blindfolded him and kept asking, "Prophesy, who is it that struck you?" And they said many other things against him, blaspheming him. We can imagine this group has been described as a mob. There appear to be some temple officers and soldiers involved, but here Luke just calls them the men that have him. They're playing these cruel games with Jesus that maybe have been played with others. You blindfold someone, and then someone in the crowd slaps the person who's blindfolded, and then they tell the person who's blindfolded, "Now guess which one of us slapped you?" And they beat him. They have a rod, and they beat him. "Who hit you with that rod?" And it's all designed to be cruel and to punish and humiliate those who've been brought to this court and are going to be accused and then punished for their crimes. So it's quite the cruel treatment from the authorities. Verse 65 says, "And they said many other things against him, blaspheming him." There were insults that were thrown. Luke doesn't record all what they are. We can imagine some of the likely vulgarity and that sort of thing that's being thrown at Jesus. The insults that they are speaking, even to the point of blaspheming, because Jesus is, after all, Emmanuel. He is God with us, and they are impugning his character and his person to the point that because he is God, it's a blasphemous thing. But they're just full of insults, and they play these cruel games where they tell him "You're a prophet, prophesy who hit you while you're blindfolded." So that was all of that, but it was designed to keep Jesus up all night, to have him constantly being disoriented with the blindfolds and pushed and beaten and slapped. And so all of those things were occurring. And Jesus, we call this lesson, Jesus Stands Alone. He has no friend there to speak up for him and help him. And so then, in verse 66, we have the next day. Finally, morning comes, and Jesus had, by this time, bruised and wounded as he is by the slaps and the punches and being hit with a stick and all of those sorts of things. We can imagine that his face is swollen, maybe some eyes closed shut, perhaps some open cuts and that sort of thing, bruises. Jesus is taken to the assembly of the elders, that would be the Sanhedrin, where the people gathered together, the chief priests and the scribes. They led him away to the council. And they said, "If you are the Christ, tell us." But he said to them, "If I tell you, you will not believe. And if I ask you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God." So they all said, "Are you the Son of God then?" And he said to them, "You say that I am." And they said, "What further testimony do we need? We've heard it ourselves from his own lips." And eventually what they're getting to, if Jesus were a mere man and yet claimed to be God, that would be a blasphemous thing in itself and against Jewish law and an accusation. So they're trying to twist Jesus' person and use his words against him. But there are several things that we want to note about this. What's going on with Jesus is a continual mocking. We already saw chapter 22 and verse 63. While in custody, they were mocking him. In chapter 23 and verse 11, and Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. And then in chapter 23 and verse 36, when he's taken to the cross, the soldiers also mocked him. I want us to recall, you can turn back there and look if you like, but I think you'll be able to just call it to mind, Isaiah chapter 53, which spoke of the suffering servant who is the Messiah when he would come, would be mistreated, would be bruised, would be wounded, would be mocked, would be insulted, would be humiliated, and all of that not for anything the servant did, but all of this for our transgressions, for our iniquities. And so to have Isaiah chapter 53 in the background of our minds as Jesus is suffering through all of these things reminds us that's just one way of showing that Jesus is indeed who he says he is, and he's fulfilling every prophecy of the Messiah. And there were some wonderful things about that. The Messiah was going to come with great wisdom of God and counsel, with wonderful teachings, with parables. He was going to give sight to the blind and have the lame to walk. But Jesus was also, the suffering servant, the Messiah, according to prophecy, would also suffer all of these things, much of this contempt, be mocked, be beaten with rods. And so Jesus is fulfilling every scripture as he undergoes these things. And what they're asking is, in verse 67 that we just read, they say, "If you are the Christ," that would be the anointed one, the Messiah that's talked about in the Old Testament, "if you are the Christ, then tell us." Well, here's the way that Jesus responds. For one thing, Jesus says, "Well, if I tell you, you will not believe." He was pointing out the insincerity of their question. If Jesus did answer in the positive, they would just use that against him, but they would not receive it as a message from God to be believed and be acted upon. So it would be useless, actually, for Jesus to answer their question then, "If you are the Christ," because even if he were to affirm that he is, they would not believe. And furthermore, Jesus says, "And if I ask you, you will not answer." So we want to remember an event that had already occurred back in Luke chapter 20, beginning at verse 1, when in the very beginning of the week, some of these same people had come to Jesus and had, considering that he was teaching in the temple every day, he had taken action in the temple like removing the con men and the overchargers that were there for the sacrifices, whatever healings he had done. They asked Jesus, by what authority do you do these things? And if you'll remember, Jesus asked them, he said, well, I'll answer your question if you answer mine. And he asked them about the authority of John the baptizer. And because that put them in a quandary, they had refused John's baptism and had not been baptized, but everybody knew John was a prophet. So the way they ended up answering was, well, we can't answer. They said, we don't know. And so Jesus is reminding them here of something that's already happened early in the week. You're asking me these questions, but you yourself are not honest with your questions nor with your answers. You won't believe me if I tell you. If I ask you questions, then you yourself won't even give an answer. So here's part of what's going on with that. One of the other things in Isaiah chapter 53 about the mistreatment of the suffering servant when all of that happened is that like a lamb to slaughter, he would be led silently to his destiny. And of course the picture is when a lamb is being taken to the butcher, the lamb doesn't know. And so if whoever owned the little lamb was leading the lamb, the lamb might have followed the shepherd many times. He just doesn't know that this time it's to the processing plant to be butchered. And so the lamb goes along silently, doesn't protest, doesn't try to run away. So Jesus, as he's undergoing all of this mocking and wounding and bruising, the beatings, and going through the questions, he's really not being cooperative with the questions. I'm not going to answer your question because you wouldn't believe. If I were to ask you a question, you wouldn't answer. But Jesus is also not trying to make a defense, and he's not running away. He's not, as he has done on other occasions. You know, there were times when Jesus was in a crowd and the crowd got threatening in one way or another, and Jesus just disappeared into the crowd, and in some miraculous way. Jesus is not running from all of that. As Jesus says in other places, and as we mentioned in this class, he says, no man takes my life from me, I lay it down. And so he's that sheep going to the slaughter. He's not protesting. He's not pulling against the ropes. He's not running away. And so his focal point turns to the people that have him, that are asking these questions, and that are doing these beatings. It is their unbelief that is put on display. It's not, Jesus is going to, throughout these proceedings, except for the false accusations at this council, by Pilate and by Herod, Jesus is going to be declared innocent. And so through all of that, it's not his guilt that is determined, but it's the guilt of these others. And part of that would be these people, when we get into the book of Acts, which Luke will also write, and we'll hear Peter's sermon on the day of Pentecost, 3,000 of them are going to believe at that point, believe to the point of repentance and baptism and wearing the name of Jesus. So that's in the future. But Jesus right now is showing them it's their faith that is absent. And that's what needs to be worked on is their faith. Jesus is going to his own destiny according to the purpose and the will of God laid out by the foreknowledge and determination of the Father, and he's doing that willingly. A couple of things before we leave the last paragraph in chapter 22. There are three phrases that are used about Jesus. One is the Christ, so that's the anointed, the Messiah. Are you the Christ? Indeed, Jesus is, but He's neither affirming nor denying. And then Jesus himself uses the phrase Son of Man. That's in verse 69. He says, the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the powers of God. The Son of Man appears in some of the apocalyptic Old Testament literature, and in particular in Daniel chapter 7 and verse 13, where the Ancient of Days gives honor and glory and a kingdom that shall never end to the Son of Man. So Jesus does identify himself with the victorious Son of Man, something for them to think about. And then they ask him, are you the Son of God then? Jesus is the Son of God in a unique way. You and I, this morning, as we sit in this building, are sons and daughters of God by creation, by faith and salvation that comes with repentance and baptism. But Jesus is Son of God in a unique way in that he is from the beginning and is himself God. The Word was in the beginning, was with God, and was God. So those phrases are important. We don't want to overlook them. So now let's go on to chapter 23. Then the whole company of them arose and brought him before Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, we found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king. And Pilate asked him, are you the king of the Jews? And he answered him, you have said so. Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, I find no guilt in this man. But they were urgent, saying, he stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee even to this place. So our last reading ended with that investigative questioning that Jesus had been put through, and they thought they had an accusation to bring that he claims to be Christ and a king. And so if he's claiming that, then that's what they're going to demonstrate before Pilate is. This is some sort of revolution. Jesus is a revolutionary figure that is in opposition to the Roman rule and to the Caesar himself, and therefore the Romans should execute him. The Jewish people don't have power to execute, but Pilate does as the Roman governor, and that's why they have to get his approval for things. So they make his accusation saying that things like he forbids us to give tribute to Caesar, which is not true. Remember the coin question, and that he had, render to Caesar what Caesar's. Here's my alarm. So it's 9:30. So those of you that have there's 3 of you that have the envelopes. If you'll pass those around, then we'll make our collection for the children's home. So they're making these accusations before Pilate, and Pilate asks him, and this is just an interesting way of speaking. Pilate said to him, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus answered and said, you have said so. Apparently that exchange, and Jesus had used that same sort of exchange earlier with the Pharisees and the council when they asked, are you the Christ? Well, you've said so. That would be the sort of thing where someone is being humble and someone else says to them, gives to them some great compliment, and even in questioning, and so the compliment is made in such a way that it's turned back on the person who said it. Regarding those people who were calling Jesus the Christ, Jesus says, well, that word just came out of your mouth and not mine. You're asking me if I'm the Christ, so you brought it up, and so you must be thinking there's something to that. And are you king of the Jews? Remember that when Jesus is crucified, Pilate is the one who's going to, over the Jews' objections, put a sign on the cross that says, "This is King of the Jews." So Pilate says to Jesus, "Are you King of the Jews?" "Well, you said those words, not me." And that would be the sort of exchange that this is. And so there must be, if you're asking, there must be something there. But, so that's the way that's going. But then Pilate, who already, he's in this situation. He doesn't want to execute an innocent person. On the other hand, given the feast time and the gathering of the Jews from all over in Jerusalem and the ire that these Jewish leaders obviously have against Jesus, he wants to appease them. He doesn't want some revolution breaking. He didn't want some riot to occur on his watch. So he's trying to walk carefully, and he sees that he has a little out here because it's mentioned by the Jewish people, and this is the last verse we read. They were urgent, saying, "He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee to this place." And Pilate says, "Oh, he's from Galilee." Well, I don't, Galilee is not really in my jurisdiction, but that's Herod. Herod happens to be in town, and Herod is the king of Galilee, of that area, and so I'll send him to Herod. This is not my problem. This is Herod's problem. We're in the wrong court here. We should have gone to the Herodian court if he's from Galilee. So here's Pilate trying to wiggle out of this situation. So here we have Jesus before Herod, beginning in verse 6. When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him over to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had long desired to see him, because he had heard about him and was hoping to see some sign done by him. So he questioned him at some length, but Jesus made no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. And Herod, with his soldiers, treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then, arraying him in splendid clothing, he sent him back to Pilate. And Herod and Pilate became friends with each other that very day, for before this they had been at enmity with each other. So here's Herod's part in this. Herod had some mixed feelings here. Going back to Luke chapter 9, I'll remind you of the reading in Luke chapter 9, verses 7 to 9. Herod had beheaded John the Baptizer, but he had not at that point met Jesus, and he had heard about this Jesus, this figure, interesting character, and miracle worker. So even in Luke chapter 9, Herod had hoped that he would run across Jesus at some point, and had not until this moment. So Herod, he's kept up with things, and he knows about this Jesus figure, and he still would. We're not trying to put any good motivations on Herod. It's kind of like he's a kid, and let's go to the circus. I'd love to see a miracle, that kind of thing. So Herod is happy to receive Jesus, but he does receive him as someone who is in chains and has an escort of prison guards and is there being vehemently accused. Jesus is still remaining silent, not offering a defense, but those who are accusing him won't stop talking and accusing him. Then, just as so often happens, and especially in that kind of situation, those who are the guards and in charge of the prisoners. They mistreat the prisoners, and so here's another group that's mocking Jesus and mistreating him, wounding and bruising him. And so Herod ends up not really getting any satisfaction from Jesus. He doesn't see what the big deal about the accusation is. Herod himself wears the title King of the Jews. And Jesus doesn't seem to be threatening in that sort of way. But in order to make fun, then when Herod sends Jesus back to Pilate, he puts some he probably goes into his closet and pulls out some royal robes he doesn't wear anymore, puts those on Jesus and sends him back to Pilate just as a laugh. And so he goes back to Pilate. So now he's back in Pilate's court, and Pilate still is going to have to deal with him. So verse 13. Then Pilate called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who is misleading the people. And after examining him before you, behold, I did not find this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither did Herod, for he sent him back to us. Look, nothing deserving death has been done by him. I will therefore punish and release him." And so here's Pilate still wanting to appease the accusers, but he also doesn't want to execute an innocent man. And you can just kind of tell by Pilate's words what he's hoping is, well, if I've put this man through a strenuous trial and even sent him to Herod and gotten Herod's, and by the way, we both came away with, we don't see really any harm, any real guilt in this person, but because you seem to hate him so, we've already beaten him and mistreated him, and he's already bruised and wounded. We'll flog him some more and then release him. And he's just hoping that will be enough to appease these people. But for a long time now, and we've been reading it all along the way, the Jews have been looking for a cause, for a reason to destroy him. They want Jesus removed from the scene. So just to be mistreated for a while and humiliated and beaten is not enough for them. And that brings us to verse 18. But they all cried out together, "Away with this man, and release to us Barabbas, a man who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection started in the city and for murder." Pilate addressed them once more, desiring to release Jesus. But they kept shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." A third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no guilt deserving death. I will therefore punish and release him." But they were urgent, demanding with loud cries that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate decided that their demand should be granted. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, for whom they asked, but he delivered Jesus over to their will. So here then is Pilate, obviously hoping to avoid stirring any waters, again, hoping that having questioned Jesus and sent him off to Herod and having already generally mistreated him, that the Jews might be satisfied that Pilate had done his due diligence here. And he expressed his preference twice, just in this conversation, to let Jesus go. But the Jewish authorities were having none of that. There was even a tradition at Passover time, and it was meant to be an appeasement from the Roman government to the Jewish crowd. If there was someone who was some prisoner who was being held by the Romans that was a hero of the Jewish people, someone the Jewish people would consider innocent, or at least someone that they admired, maybe for whatever he had done that put him in prison, that there would be a prisoner release, as sort of a celebration from the Romans to the Jews at Passover time. So Pilate figures he'll use that to have Jesus released. Jesus will be the prized prisoner who's released. But the Jews instead call for the release. They've even got a name. No, we don't want Jesus released. If you're going to release somebody, give us Barabbas, who he was indeed an insurrectionist. That's what they're accusing Jesus of, although Jesus is innocent of that. And Barabbas was a murderer. Had killed someone and is some political killing, most likely. Maybe low-life sort of political killing, but Barabbas had done that. And again, what an insult this is, to have a person like Barabbas, who is guilty of these terrible things, released, and Jesus, the innocent one, who they are calling out for crucifixion. And what Pilate does eventually is to give in to the crowd. Pilate had said multiple times, I don't find anything deserving of death here. As a matter of fact, I don't find any guilt at all here. I even referred to Herod. And Herod doesn't seem bothered by any guilt of this person. And yet the crowd, the way the scriptures put it is, the voices of the crowd prevailed. Pilate, who was trying to, in his desires, to release Jesus, instead gives in to the crowd, and we're told that he then delivered Jesus over to their will. I have a couple of questions at the end. Why did Jesus offer no defense at his trials? And there's a lot in that. Part of it is Jesus knows this is his destiny. This is his mission. This is what he came to do. This is God's scheme of redemption, that Jesus should die as the innocent sacrifice for the sins of the people. It also has been prophesied. One reason Jesus didn't offer a defense is because it was useless to do so. Even when the courts declared him innocent, that was useless talk to those who were his accusers. And also, kind of a little part of it seems Jesus didn't want to give the satisfaction of protesting his own situation to the others. What were some of the factors developing into a crescendo of bloodthirstiness for Jesus? One is the Jewish people saw the adoring crowds on the first day of that week. And then Jesus had run the money changers out of the temple. And then Jesus was popular with the people in his teaching throughout. And then when they did arrest him, Jesus didn't protest. I think that just irritated them more and got under their skin. So his silence was frustrating to them. And just the way that mob mentality works, working to crucify Jesus. And we ask the question, how can we promote justice over injustice in our societies and systems? Remember, this lesson we called Jesus Stands Alone. And there is a time for us to stand up for what is right and to not give in to corrupt powers, but for people to speak and to speak together against injustice in our own societal systems. And then, so how did Jesus handle himself through all this circus? And I think the answer is as much as was possible with dignity and aplomb. Jesus was laying his life down, and he did so because this is the Father's will. And so Jesus did that with grace and with love for our salvation.